We good?
Let's go. I'm ready.
Sweet. So David,
Luke,
hello.
lovely to be here.
Yeah, so thanks for speaking to me today. So David, you're like an evangelist, apologist, and you spend your time, a lot of your time, thinking about theology, Christianity, and you spend time at Speaker's Corner, which is where you're known. So you're David of Speaker's Corner.
Speaker's Corner. Yes, I am. I want to say that I do all these things, not professionally, but just in the most amateur capacity possible. But I'm glad that people actually want to talk to me regarding these things and hear more from me. But yes, you're right. So I'm a Christian, and I try to dibble and dive into anything really where I can potentially help the kingdom expand in any way that I can. My love in this area is more so apologetics, and through that, I perform some evangelism, primarily at Speaker's Corner.
Amen. So tell us about that. What is apologetics?
Yeah, no. So effectively, apologetics, just as a term, is simply just providing a defense for anything controversial. It can be any topic. It isn't just centered around being religious or around theology. You can be an apologist for the most obscure things. You can be an apologist for an advocate for snakes, for example. There are people who are advocates and apologists for dolphins, or whatever the case is. Me in particular, I want to do something more sort of useful and be an apologist for the Christian faith. Interestingly, in the time that we live in, there are many, there have always really been many enemies against the faith in various different contexts. In the modern day, the majority of the enemies that we have are around either other competing religions, cults, humanism, or the idea of abandoning the Christian faith, taking some of the elements from it that have been profitable to humanity, but then divorcing it completely from its history. So I think in this era, and in probably eras to come, and in eras that have been past, there's always been a case to be an apologist for the faith.
Nice, love that. So I guess in terms of foundation and like bedrock, how did you become a Christian? Because I'm guessing you have like a stronger faith and a mature faith to be what you're doing. So how did that come about? How did you become a Christian? And what does faith mean to you?
No, super interesting. I'll sort of answer them as quickly as I can, just to make sure that we can get through as many things as possible today. In becoming a Christian, I don't have that story that a lot of people have when in their teenage years or in adulthood, they lived a life of obscurity or just didn't care about religion. Suddenly one day they had that very like tangible, either like visual or stimulating experience where they encountered something that they just couldn't explain, and that led them to the faith. It would be lovely to have one of those, but that isn't quite my origin into the Christian faith. So I'm Nigerian, and I was born into a Christian family. So baptized as a baby and taken to church basically every Sunday by my mother, whether I wanted to go or not. So that's the sort of interesting path of my sort of journey in the faith, because I more so did it as a child. I did enjoy the faith, particularly the Old Testament. So everything, I'm a big fan of the Old Testament because my mom would always read us Old Testament stories every night before we went to bed. Right. Huge fan of David. I could talk for like 3 hours on David alone, right? But it's like an action movie or like a Greek epic. There's heroes and villains and people with like powers given to them by God, not generated by their own selves. So I did that effectively from when I was born all the way into my late teenage years. And then as happens with everybody, you get a little bit rebellious when you're entering that sort of early stage or late stage sort of teenage culture. I had some negative experiences in the church, nothing too fundamentally bad, but even as a child, I recognized that there were certain practices that we had in our churches, mostly around financing, that I always just thought didn't quite make sense. The idea that the pastor should be rich because Solomon's rich, right? But then even as a child, you read about the disciples and like how they were fishermen, like sort of a very, in the modern day, simple role. Jesus himself didn't have like a formal job. Yes, he was a carpenter, but he wasn't like an extravagantly rich person. Whatever he needed was provided for him. Whenever he needed, for example, money to pay the temple tax, a fish would appear, right? And exactly how much he needed for himself and his oldest disciple would be there. So this message didn't quite like tally very well with me. And so it just carried on because I went to mostly Nigerian churches for the majority of my life. And after a while, I sort of decided that, you know what? I I don't like this specific brand of Christianity. And if this is all the faith is, then I'm just going to sort of back away. I can still believe in a God and whatever the case is, but I'm not really going to practice the Christian faith. I did that for a number of years as well. Luckily, in that time, I didn't dive into complete debauchery, for example. I didn't start like smoking or drinking or partying. Actually, I did the very opposite. I just started working a lot. So I for a time, I was working for the sort of like 4-year stint that I wasn't like practicing. I was working 2 jobs consistently over a 4-year period. So every Saturday and Sunday night when my friends who were in uni would want to go out, I wasn't available. I was working. So I sort of kept myself out of trouble while I wasn't in the Christian faith. God knows what would happen if I was idle during that time. But I think even in that, God did sort of like focus me into something else just so I wouldn't go too far away. Eventually, during the pandemic, I came back into the fold. I was invited into the faith by somebody who I had met. And so I gave it a chance again as a semi-adult at 20, what was I, like 24, 25. And I wanted to sort of rediscover the faith now that I felt like I knew more and I had more opinions other than just listening to everything that my mom or a random pastor would say about the faith. I started diving into like hermeneutics, understanding how these certain things are read, what they've meant potentially historically, not just in the modern day. And then in sort of doing all that, I found my way into Speaker's Corner videos because there were people explaining these concepts that I had just believed as a notion as a child, but never really dived into them. Sure, yes, we believe in 3 persons who are one God, and how? I don't know. Just that's what we believe, and that's pretty much it. I couldn't explain this to you like in a very detailed manner or whatever the case was. But then I saw people doing that at the corner, and so I watched the corner for about a year. Watched a lot of like Ball with Speakers Corners videos. There were other speakers as well. A guy who hasn't come in a while called Ben Beal, and then there were a bunch of other nut jobs too who are at the corner with very, very different views. Yeah. So I like to see the interaction between Christian speakers and then Hebrew Israelites, atheists, Hindus, and predominantly Muslims. So I found it all very interesting in the very beginning. But after observing it for about a year, I started to notice something a bit off. It seems that there are about 3 Christian speakers, and then they keep getting ganged up on every week consistently by Muslims. And initially I waved it off. Okay, maybe they're just very passionate. But then I started to see more of a gang-style mentality in how they behaved versus how the Christians behaved. So after a while, I felt convicted to go there and support the Christians. My first day there, this was around in 2022, like in the summertime, I fall into a debate. And luckily, I'm somewhat armed in their tactics because I've watched the videos and I just happen to learn how to interact with people by osmosis of watching things and how people behave. So I do decently well. Not very well, but decently well. And then I go and meet the speakers. Then somehow I come back again one more time in 2022. And then I come back again in January 2023. And somehow some kind of conviction just tells me that, well, I just said I'm going to come every week this entire year. And I basically came almost every single week. I think I missed about 2 weeks, one entire year. And I've been going there ever since. And the last question, or the last answer to the last question you asked, what does faith mean to me? I'm still not a very super emotional person. So I'd love to give you like a long speech about, faith and the beauty of it. It is truly a beautiful thing. And the way that you can experience that does vary quite a lot. But just to give a bit of like a robotic answer, to me, faith implies being convicted that something is true and doesn't have contradictions in it, just in a very basic sense. And the way that I actually encounter my Christian faith is the way that I would have faith or a belief in anything else. So there are mystical elements to our faith and our religion as Christians, but also there's historic elements, there's factual elements. And the same way that I would approach any other fact of history or knowledge of history or knowledge of the modern world, I apply that same thing to the Christian faith. And I find that 100 times out of 100 times, there's always a way to either reconcile or rectify whatever doubts or concerns you might have in the way that is essentially the same as you would if you encountered a math problem or a historical problem. So that's what I like about the faith, and that's what faith sort of means to me.
Love that. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
sharing. So, yeah, I'm just prompted to ask, but for those people who might be watching who are maybe, like, say, less emotional perhaps, what kind of, like, basics do you need in order to be a Christian, like the shortened version, if like, I mean, go a bit more deeply later?
Yeah, I mean, you see, you can go as generic as you want, right? And just like generically, you need to be convicted of the words and instructions of Christ and his apostles. So you need to effectively, in some kind of way, come to the realization that the things that Jesus says are weighty. They aren't just pretty words. And so you then need to be convicted to actually try your best to follow these things, follow the institution that Christ established, and also follow the teachings and the deeds of his apostles to the best of your ability. I think if I had to call it very basic, that would be how I would describe it. There are people who claim to, believe in Christ, random hippies or whatever, who don't want to actually be convicted by his words and claim to believe in him. And they can have a notion of who he is. He was all about peace and love and acceptance. These things are true. But there are other things that he also said. So I would say the very basic would be to be convicted of all those things that he said.
Amen.
Yeah, amen.
Let's go. So, moving on to more faith and theology, I guess, and we'll come on to a bit more of the corner in a little bit. So what do you see as maybe some of the core differences that sets Christianity apart from other worldviews?
This is also very interesting, right? Because I think I have a very nuanced view of this. Belief in general and mythology and religion, humans aren't all that varied, really. There's a lot of us, but we have a handful of ideas that we sort of rinse and repeat and remix. So actually, and this will sound somewhat controversial, but there's historical backing for this. Christianity isn't completely alien to the world. There are many concepts in the faith that are very similar to many other religions. We believe in charity. We believe in kindness towards our fellow man. We believe in improving the world, caretaking it, making it a better place. Just very generically. And many other religions around the world will have the same view. Specifically, what differentiates us from all of the other world religions? There are a number of things that we can dive into. But in the way that I would discount maybe other world religions, a lot of them will have the idea of gods or deities that are a part of the created order. It will depend upon what your view of the universe is. If you believe it's eternal, then okay, fine. Maybe you can justify it that way. If you hold it to be ever-changing, have a beginning point and an ending point, then it's interesting that many other religions view their deities and gods as just a part of this ever-changing universe. Raises the question, if your God is simply a part of it, he was, born, died, or a God died and then resulted in the sea being made from its blood, or whatever the case is, then is there a possibility that there could be some kind of supreme God even greater than your God who is born and who dies? And that's sort of like what the Christian faith and a few others posits. Then if you discount all the other religions that have gods and deities that are just like a part of the created order, their eye is the moon and their breath is the sun, or whatever the case is, right? Then you have a sort of smaller handful of religions that maybe believe in a God that is somehow separated or outside of the created order. Among those religions, what is the most meaningful way that then this God interacts with humanity? Is it just by obscure instruction? Or what's tantalizing about the Christian message, did God actually set foot here, live with us, suffer in ways that many of us will not be able to actually experience in this life, and then come back with a promise of us then attaining the same kind of glorification that he has attained, at least in his humanity? That's a very compelling message, not just for somebody who wants to be emotional, but for somebody who wants to actually know who this ultimate creator God is and have almost no way of disputing that this God does exist in a way that actually matters to people, because many critics will be materialists. They only believe in things that they can see, touch, and feel, or things that have happened in an actual world. So it's amazing that we can sort of take that or pull that rug under their feet, where we believe in all these mystical things about God, but also in the same way that we buy into history, God has appeared in our history, and we can provide evidences and cases for that. And the things that he said when he was here do carry weight to this day and have transformed the world in an unbelievable way.
Love that. There's a lot to go through
Oh
there.
yeah, please go
So,
for it.
do you find that the person of Jesus is one of the more convincing parts of your evangelism? If you were to contrast that with like arguments or certain arguments, for example, the cosmological argument from mathematics and so on, or would you say the person of Jesus and his character and what he did, this kind of thing, is that more powerful with people when you're speaking? You've got like a big like data set of people who you can pull from, right? You speak to people all the time about these different things. So what kind of like cuts through and can really like bring people, at least get them interested in the Christian message?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about data sets. It's going to be very varied in terms of what attracts people to the Christian faith. Just two anecdotal stories that I've heard on my time in the corner. There was a person who told me about a group of fishermen who, in the modern day, who were being evangelized to by a Christian. And the Christian was talking with them, telling them about Jesus Christ and the Christian faith. And they were sort of like blank in expression. Then when they heard the detail that the first apostles that were called were fishermen, suddenly that connected with them. And so they were more convinced of the entire Christian message in the person of Jesus by the fact that fishermen attested to him than the fact of just hearing about him as a whole. There was even another instance I heard where, this person is still sort of arguing with their faith and teetering on the line of becoming a Christian, but they were in a foreign country where they experienced something where a lamb was killed in front of them when they were a child. And they weren't expecting it. They went to a farm, and basically the farmer was culling some of the lambs, and they saw it happen, and that traumatized them for quite a while as a young child. Then in their teenage years, they saw an image in a restaurant or a area of residence of Jesus carrying a lamb, and somehow that made them intrigued about actually looking into the Christian faith. So it's going to vary quite wildly. But certainly, people who hear about the person of Christ and his suffering, definitely that is quite a visceral, emotional tug that will get people interested in finding out who this person is, who even after he had died and then we say resurrected, his followers didn't seek revenge, for example, as you would find in many other like cultic practices in the past. And also, the followers, importantly, didn't just vanish into thin air. There's so many cults that we know about and we haven't even heard of, where once the core figure dies, the entire thing dilutes and vanishes from history. But oddly, the core figure of the Christian faith dies. The claimants say he resurrects. He then also leaves again and doesn't return to them in a direct fashion. But instead of scattering into the wind, they survive persecution even of their faith. So it's hard enough to convince people when everything is fine. But when you're being persecuted too, it's even more difficult. Yeah. So I think the great thing about the Christian faith is there are a insanely large amount of ways that you can reach out to people by forming commonalities between what we have in the gospel message, in the book of Acts, in the epistles of Paul and James and Peter and John and even Jude. But also, you can actually anchor all of that in the person of Christ. But it's amazing that Christ, being God, has so many. He called the right people at the right time in the right language. He had all these like odd interactions that may seem meaningless to the Pharisees or the Sadducees at that time, but yet those things are the things that attract people into the faith over time. So it's quite amazing, actually, that is the case.
Man, so you mentioned suffering there. I think that's just an interesting point to consider. So why did Jesus have to suffer in the first place? A lot of people, when maybe saying why they don't believe in God, because they acknowledge and they recognize that there's so much suffering in the world. It's there for all to see. So why did he need to suffer? Was that part of the equation, I guess?
Yeah.
So could you just speak to what that is and why Jesus did that in the first place.
We all experience suffering, and suffering is something very visceral that we can all attest to. We suffer in some extreme ways at times, wars and famines. We suffer in very, random ways. Kim Kardashian crying about her sister buying the same car that she has, right?
Okay.
But it's something that we all experience in varying degrees. Does it therefore mean that Christ has to undergo the worst kind of suffering imaginable to, in some kind of way, have us relate to him? Not necessarily. But Christ comes into this world that is severely imperfect, where people are ruled by their desires and various other vices. But he comes in here as an exemplar of what we should aspire to. And the world ultimately reacts to him in a way where, because of jealousy and fear of his message of perfection, they want to stamp him out in any way that they can. So Christ comes and suffers the cruelty of the world. But despite that suffering of the cruelty, he returns and then promises us that we will also overcome the cruelty of the world. So there is some necessity in Christ's suffering in the Christian faith, because as Christians, he tells us that because the world hated him for his message of truth and his actions, they will also hate us. If Christ didn't suffer, then potentially the message of Christianity will be a little bit more unconvincing. We have this like demigod figure. He's kind of a man and kind of God at the same time. No, that's not what we believe, but that's what others, for example, criticize us as believing. He comes down and he teaches and flies away again, and that's all. Seems very, Greco-Roman, right? And who believes in that today? But the fact that Christ then also sees the worst, or is seen to interact with the worst that the world has to offer and overcome that, is essential to the Christian faith. So at the very least, for us, Christ had to suffer. Because of us, Christ had to suffer. And because of Christ, we can overcome our suffering.
So a lot of people will hear about something called the atonement, which the suffering is involved in that. Could you explain what that means? And maybe it was a little bit about the atonement.
Yeah, so generically speaking, we don't need to be anthropologists to see that human beings are flawed. And there's many reasons why we can talk about that. There can be environmental factors, anthropological factors, or anthropomorphic factors with human beings. Or I think there's some anthropogenic or whatever. So there's many reasons why we are flawed. Yet we still seek perfection. There's a reason why we work to iterate and improve upon what we've done previously. And you can see that consistently towards history, but also towards ourselves as individuals. If we play football, we want to increasingly get better. Why? Well, what are we aspiring for? What are we aspiring to attain? And so one answer to that is perfection. We want to achieve a state where we fully embody the fullest capacity in every means of our lives possible. How do we get there? The Japanese and the Chinese talk about like arts of like constantly, endlessly perfecting your craft. But human beings are limited in what they can perfect in one lifetime. We don't live that long, 100 or so years if we're lucky, but more so around the time of like 80 years for the majority of us. So we are imperfect, we recognize it, and we're chasing perfection. But to what end? So that's where the idea or the Christian message of things like the fall, which people hate for some reason to reckon with, the idea that through human activity, even though made perfect, in terms of perfection being us fully actualizing what it means to be a created man in the beginning by God, we have, through our own action and repeated action, fallen from that perfect state that we were originally created in. People will criticize us and say, because I've heard the term that because a man ate an apple, babies die of cancer. That's a very, that's a very sort of like repugnant way of putting the whole message, right? It would be like me saying, because you don't believe in God, it's so okay to just murder babies, right? For example, if I was talking to an atheist, that way they wouldn't hold that necessarily to be the case, but the conclusion doesn't actually follow from the initial premise. There's a lot more to it. So we believe, and it's clear to see, that humanity and the world around us is far off from where we ideally would like it to be, the idea of utopia. How do we achieve utopia? Is it a useless dream that we can just never seem to achieve? Is it like, is it like unicorns and dragons? Just something in the mind of different civilizations that just they put on art and put in movies and that's all. Christians will say no, that there is a need for us to atone, for us to reckon with our imperfection, reckon with the mind that turns away from God, and then overcome that with the assistance of God and the free gift of grace that he imbues upon us through the person of Jesus Christ. And then walk in the standards of Jesus Christ after being baptized and indoctrinated into the Christian faith. And then, as Christ says, he who perseveres to the end will be saved. So when you've reckoned with your imperfection, recognize the origin of your imperfection, and then recognize the solution for your imperfection and the road to perfection, that is sort of how I would describe what the atonement is in Christianity. You're going to have different sects of Christianity describe it in different ways, but it's fundamentally about reckoning with your imperfection, and as Christ said, becoming perfect, even as your Father in heaven is also perfect. And without perfection, then ultimately we perpetually remain in a state of imperfection, which is the thing that all human beings are trying to get away from, whether they want to admit it or not.
And so what exactly, you mentioned being saved there.
Yes.
So what are we being saved from? And what was going towards, I guess?
Being saved from the evils of this world that we don't really need to describe. It's very evident that there are things that strive away from the good or strive away from God in our reality. We would like a reality without wars and famines and abuse. So these things put us in danger, and the entire world wants to be saved from these things, never have to experience these things again. But these things are consequences of our human imperfection. So what we are moving towards, ideally, is a place where we no longer have these things. In the time that we live in, humans have done a good job of reducing wars and conflicts. There's so many of us, there's so many more of us today than there have ever been at any point in history. So we're trending towards utopia. I wouldn't want to be born in any other time period apart from the one that I'm in now. That could be me being biased, but we're trending towards utopia. Christians have done a great deal to trend us towards that direction. But physical utopia still entails that at some point we're going to die. And that's something that we also want to overcome. I was watching a Joe Rogan podcast a few years ago, and there was a particular interesting character on there who was talking about viewing death as a disease. So something that should be treated as opposed to accepted. So again, we're trending towards a time when we are in a utopia that isn't just physical, but also spiritual, in that we're able to even conquer death as Christ has.
Moving on a little bit, slightly different. So I'd love to talk about like Christian discipleship, Christian living.
Yes.
So yeah, can you share like how do you live out your faith day to day? So for example, going to the shops, going to work, the gym, whatever it is where you find yourself with friends, with family.
Yep.
And yeah, what does that look like? And what like tips, I guess, or practices can you give?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is I'm a fundamentally lazy person, right? Which is like the first thing that I'd say. And I've realized this for a long period of time. And so what that actually helps me to do is to dovetail quite well with the Christian message. I will never blow my horn or be egotistical. I am not that amazing. I'm actually I'm pretty unremarkable, actually. And so because I'm happy with accepting that as a reality, for me, this makes it a lot easier to actually be a Christian if the message is that we are all unremarkable in a specific way, in that we are not perfect. We're not meeting the standard that God has. So we want to trend towards that direction. How do I do this? So I try my best to essentially follow the instructions of Christ, his actions, his deeds, and those of the apostles. I'm not going to match them one-to-one. I am not going to start wearing a toga or cloth and sandals everywhere. That isn't what the emulation actually entails. But Simple things. Love your neighbor. Doesn't mean that if my neighbor is an alcoholic, that I love my neighbor by giving him more alcohol. I try my best to be kind towards people. I try my best to be helpful towards people. I don't always succeed. There are times when I walk past a homeless person because maybe on that day I'm busy or I just don't have the time. I don't have the capacity to help every single homeless person I see. But if I ever receive conviction to do it for a certain person, then certainly I will do. I'm always quick to offer assistance whenever I can. I try my best to stay away from obvious vices that many people trip into or fall into. Luckily for myself, I have no interest in like smoking or drinking or being promiscuous. Other people do. But I am confident enough to realize that my fault is laziness. And I understand that this is the thing that I need to overcome. I fail consistently at doing it. And as well as others would fail if maybe they had like an anger or a wrath issue or they had like a perpetual lying issue. But the idea is to always ask for forgiveness. Have the humility to realize that what you're doing isn't justifiable or isn't justified. And consistently don't think too highly of yourself. Think more highly of Christ. And then in thinking highly of Christ, try to conform yourself to his image. Obviously with his help. Go as a Christian, go to church. Be around other Christians. Don't be in isolation. That can breed strange ideas and strange interpretations. And also, it's not very, if you're an island, it's not very convincing. The idea of the Christian faith is that we are a family in Christ, adopted into the lineage of Abraham. You don't just stay away from your family the entire time. You commune with them, eat with them, worship with them, pray for each other. So these are the ways that I at least attempt, as imperfect as I am, to live out a Christian life. Can I do more? Absolutely, I always can. But it's that realization and the humility to realize that you can always do more that continuously drives me in the faith.
You touched on prayer there towards the end. How does prayer play a part of your life?
Effectively, it's a great focusing sort of like element in my life. Prayer simply just means to ask a request from a third party. Particularly Christian prayer is super interesting to me because I remember being afraid of the dark as a kid, for example. I get sent down some stairs in the basement to get some things, and the light switch is like I further down than I would like, and I'm fearful that a monster I've seen in a movie will just come out and grab me or whatever, and I'll never see my mom again or whatever. So as a kid of 6 or 5, I start reciting Psalm 23, something that my mom teaches me. I'm reciting it as I'm walking down the stairs. I'm fearful the entire time, but somehow the prayer is enabling me to take one step in front of the other as I move towards my ultimate goal. I'm still afraid. I'm still thinking it. But if I didn't have that, I wouldn't be able to even take a step. So even today, I still make those kinds of prayers whenever I'm fearful, for example. But it's also important to remember that we shouldn't just treat God as a genie. And this is the hard part. It's difficult to pray and thank God, for example, when something bad happens to you. It's very difficult. We only ever want things to be amazing and right at all times. So we pray and request for things. But interestingly is praying when things go wrong, either for deliverance or even acceptance of that thing. Because maybe the thing went wrong because you attempted something that wasn't correct. And then again, when you have that humility to actually praise God when things go horribly wrong, as for example, the psalmists do, it's very difficult. So it's fundamental. It's effectively, and we have all these other sort of worldly kinds of alternatives for it. Meditation. Christians do meditate, obviously, on God. But people who are non-theistic will just meditate on themselves, the universe, nature. So fundamentally, prayer is essential for everyone to cast their mind back to God. But even those who don't use it for God still use it for various things. The idea of affirmations, the idea of like, commanding the universe, almost like working with the universe for your betterment, meditation. These are all things that effectively cast back or have a use in the Christian faith. but just directed towards God and not towards the world.
Speaking of Christian living, so at the moment in the culture, there's talk a lot about masculinity, what that
Yes.
means, what that doesn't mean. There's lots of like competing like narratives and people wanting to like control the frame of what masculinity
Yes.
is. So what would you say if you could like maybe define masculinity for us, and how do we live out and honor God in that? And
Yeah.
how do you go like maybe practically as well? Like how do you like live as like a Christian man in this
Yeah.
world, which is clearly not living in a biblical way, I guess.
Yeah.
And also, if you could speak to, we hear about Jesus turning the other cheek.
Yes.
What does that mean and not mean? I've heard it said in so many different ways, but sometimes it seems to be at the moment, people will use that for like pacifism.
Yes.
Whereas, is that what Jesus meant by that?
Okay. No, absolutely. Just very generically, I would say that masculinity is an umbrella term. It effectively encapsulates like a list of qualities that are expected or typically found more commonly in a certain kind of human, should I say, and those are directed towards men. Now, certainly, some of these traits are unisex. For example, courage. Traditionally, at least in like the Greco-Roman idea, or even generally universally, courage is ascribed to men. Men are the forerunners and like the very experimental sort of like sector of between the two sexes, male and female. They are the ones who are more likely to go and poke an alligator to find out if they can use it as a stepping stone across the lake. So the list of qualities: courage, the idea of being sort of like stoic and being able to take pain without showing emotion, the control, the ability to have balance in within your livelihood. These are things that are more looked for or sought after in the masculine or male frame. A good man, in my opinion, will actually have both the qualities expected of a man, but also some of those of a woman. For example, temperance, patience. These are things that you don't normally associate with masculinity, but you would, for example, with femininity. Women can wait for something to happen. They're a little bit less sort of like a ticky about getting instant gratification. Maybe not so much today, but in the past, that's the general idea. So a good man encapsulates the things that are to be expected of him properly and sort of like finds the golden mean by not being deficient in, for example, courage and temperance, but also not being excessive in those things, as they then lead to vices. The problem that we're having, or maybe that we've always had really, but particularly today on social media, is that people are recognizing that there is a need for men to hold masculine traits, classically masculine traits. But there is a deficiency in the way that men are actualizing these traits today because of various factors in society. Things are very easy right now. So courage almost isn't that important. There's a police force somewhere or firefighters. So do I really need to be courageous anymore? Maybe not. To counteract this, people aren't trying to turn a deficiency into a sort of like a medium way. They're trying to turn it into excessiveness. And that's what you're seeing with red pill culture or incel culture or any culture that is concerning in the modern day. So there's a need to sort of return more to a happy medium than to be deficient or excessive in masculinity. The person of Christ actually encapsulates this perfectly. Christ is caring for children, caring for widows, protective over his disciples and all those he encounters. He's stern with people. Matthew 23, he can even rebuke people. He chases the tax collectors from the temple because they have turned his father's house into a den of thieves. So he isn't afraid to even go against popular culture to extol what is correct. But in the same token, Christ doesn't fight when he is arrested by the mixture of the Roman and the sort of Sanhedrin colleagues or mob. He doesn't cry out for a saving when he is being brutalized by the Romans. He knows what is happening, what must be done. He does accept it. Even in the garden, He does cry out for the cup, for what is to come to be taken away from him. But he's resolute in the conclusion instead of running like a coward. So, when Christ says to turn the other cheek, it isn't simply a call to pacifism, which there might be cases when that's required. The psalmists talk about there being a time for war and a time for peace. In times of peace, you try not to begin wars. So certainly, yes, there is a case for pacifism in a certain context in Christianity. Is Christ only saying to become a doormat and receive abuse and not to defend yourself? No, that isn't the case. What Christ preaches against is excessive violence, sort of with the instance of Peter in the garden cutting off the ear of the centurion or the Jewish helper, and then Christ returns the ear and says to Peter, those that live by the sword die by the sword. Not to mean that you cannot defend yourself or those around you, but if your first inclination at every turn is violence, then certainly you're increasing the likelihood that you may meet your end with violence if you're only ever violent to solve any discourse. In the slapping example, turning the other cheek, Christ gives 3 examples. Turning the other cheek when you were slapped. Going an extra mile when somebody impresses you to walk 1 mile. There's a historic case to be made where Romans were able to actually conscript randomly any Jewish person to carry their equipment for 1 mile. Or if someone asks you for a tunic, give them your cloak. So effectively, to put all of that into like a simple phrase, if you're saying that you're about it, and about it here means following Christ, then be about it. Showcase that you are following Christ. Go the extra mile even when people insult you. However, you have a right to protect yourself. You know, David was a warrior king. And yes, there were certain things that he couldn't do. For example, build a temple because his hands had spilt blood. But Christ or God still loves David for his repentance. So yes, as Christians, we should absolutely extol masculine values if we are males. We should be courageous, defensive, but not excessive in how we do so, because Christ wasn't excessive or deficient in how he showcased masculinity.
Very good answer. Love
Thank
that.
you.
Cheers, David. So bringing it back to Speaker's Corner and then your time there, your experience. So what is the typical atmosphere like there for, let's just say, the normal person?
Yep.
Let's say a spectator, a tourist, that kind of thing. And then what is it like for somebody who's actively engaging with people of different contrasting views?
Super interesting, because I have been both. And I see both every Sunday when I go. So in the very beginning, there is a tension in the atmosphere. People are very opinionated. So it's not like a very calm and inviting environment. You go there and people are arguing tooth and nail over some topic. It can be a war, a conflict, a political idea, a sexual idea, a moral idea, or a religious idea. So it can be quite tense, but you can get quite good stuff out of it if you're just a spectator. But there's always a need to also jump into the fray if you're a certain kind of person. So you might get invited into it without even wanting or having any intention to join, which often happens, particularly with instances where I see Muslims particularly target people who don't look like they either know their faith, have a faith, or aren't very strong in their faith. So the opposite end then is what I've now become, somebody who frequents the corner. So what do I see? From my perspective, the last 3 years have been very interesting. Before the last 3 years, there was a concerted effort by the Muslims in particular to sort of like convert and convince well-meaning white English people, for example, of the virtues of Islam. Yes, there are virtues in Islam, but there is no unique virtue that isn't either already found in Christianity to a greater extent or just borrowed from Christianity, wholesale. So they would be very deceptive in the way that they gave the message of their faith. They would tell small token lies about their religious figure. They would claim that he did things or had opinions that actually their own sources directly contradict. All in an effort to basically get a shahada, a testament of faith said in Arabic and in English by a well-meaning white person or whatever, just so they could feel good about themselves and about their message. What I've seen over the last 3 years is this practice is still going on, but the positive results from them are basically non-existent. When I first came, they would brag that every week they were getting multiple people to testify to believe in Islam. Now you barely hear any of that. So Christians have been very effective at coming to the corner, understanding Islamic objections, and in dealing with those objections as well. Not just with Muslims, obviously, but also atheist objections, Hindu objections. I've even had topics where Sikhs came up and talked about what they thought about Christianity. So Christianity now has a stronger foothold. And even there are some sort of atheists that have come to the corner for decades. And interestingly, there's a popular figure called Steve the Atheist. And he, in talking to me recently, he said, it's very interesting what's happened over the last couple of years. I'm seeing Christians do to the Muslims what Muslims used to do to Christians, implying that we now have argumentation. We take argumentation to them. We're not just defensive anymore, but now we also attack in terms of being able to put across ideas and criticisms of their faith. So it's a very good time, I think, to be at the corner if you're somebody who likes to openly discuss these topics. The corner is not a church. The corner is not a place to get your theology from. The corner is not a place to come and make friends or seek belonging. It's a battleground of some sorts. So it's not somewhere where you should always go. And if you're the kind of person that gets emotional quickly, it's not for you. But if you can hold your own, if you can not take things personally, and if you have a strong conviction in what you already believe, then certainly you can be useful at the corner, particularly if you're a Christian.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said at the last point. It's definitely a battleground. When I've been there, definitely sense that.
Yeah. In the air.
So I'd love it if you could speak to, so you mentioned that you've spoken to or experienced some Muslims who have come over. They might have different intentions to you, perhaps, in terms of what they're wanting to do. So have you got an example of good behaviors that some Muslims exhibit? And also, would you be able to, what can Christians do wrong as well and also do well?
Yep. Islam's an umbrella, like every other religious faith. So you're going to find some well-meaning, well-intentioned Muslims who come to the corner. I will say people who come to the corner tend to be more animated, myself included. So I am certainly not the best exemplar of what Christianity is. Absolutely not. I'm very comfortable with saying how imperfect that I am. The same thing might be true for Muslims as well. The ones that come to the corner are exceptionally animated, and so they might not be the best interpretation of what Islam is. But I have had good conversations with well-meaning Muslims or people who were even in the Islamic faith and then later on decided to leave it. And those are some of my favorite conversations with people. But more often than not, I am speaking against somebody who's very antagonistic. In more recent terms, I haven't actually had that many conversations because I've built sort of a brand, if you will, with the people at the corner for being sort of no nonsense. I don't need to yell at you or scream at you or curse you and your mother and your daughter and your sister or use racial epithets against you. These are all things that I've experienced from Muslims at the corner. I don't need to do any of that, but I'm not so accommodating where I let them run the entire conversation or run away from a point that I've raised. So I'm very sticky on those things. And these are things that they don't like. It doesn't allow them to effectively perform their deceptive tactics. But Christians, on the other hand, there are many things that we do at the corner that aren't absolutely correct. Take myself, for example. There are times that I engage in insult battles because as imperfect as I am, it's fun. It's fun to be able to clash with somebody and exchange teasing remarks. I don't mean it from a malicious place, but it may be if I'm seen insulting somebody and calling them various things that aren't very nice. That might discourage somebody from joining the faith who otherwise would have. So, and that is something that I have to deal with. Other Christians do the same thing as well at the corner. Sometimes we allow very destructive ideas to fester until they become not very useful, and then we have an issue with them at that point, and we have to sort of deal with. We have we've had like a Unitarian crisis once at the corner where people started to adopt very wrong Christian theology. We're currently dealing with a bit of a modalist crisis right now. So these things will obviously continue irrevocably, like going forward. And then the last thing would be people who are either too ecumenical or very anti-ecumenical at the corner. The ecumenism, just very distinctly, is just the idea of getting along, being as sort of like open as possible on the commonalities that we have within Christian denominations, but also trying to not extol the differences that we have too much. Now, there are many Christians who will have many different views on this. Some are extremely anti-ecumenical. No, Catholics are X, Protestants are X, Orthodox are X, and some are like, oh, we all believe the exact same thing. Both, again, these are sort of extremes on either end. And then I believe that there is a middle path. But we have had instances, particularly on the sort of more destructive end, where there have been Christians who have come to the corner with the sole purpose of dogging on another sect and the things that they believe, even to the most extreme, being actually more ecumenical with other faiths like Islam than actually within the own Christian umbrella itself. Absolutely insane. But these are some of the things that I see that we do wrong. But we're always praying for improvements. And so I think that does happen, but it's a consistent battle.
So Speaker's Corner is one way of evangelism. What other good ways are there to spread the gospel, the Bible's message? How can people go about that if they don't want to go to Speaker's Corner? What else can they do?
Again, like I said, Speaker's Corner is not essential whatsoever. I use Speaker's Corner as a vehicle for apologetics. That's how I was reintroduced to the faith. It's important to know that what you believe isn't just a fairy tale, but it's something tangible and you can defend it. I think that's what the corner is good for. I've seen an explosion over the last 2 years even in apologetics globally. And I think that the corner, big creators that we have, like God Logic, for example, and David Wood, an apostate prophet, they've all contributed to this. I think the two sort of like across the pond interactions have like coalesced, and now I'm seeing the most random people engaged in apologetics. I'm seeing like 14-year-olds do it, and they're sort of like reciting arguments that I've heard at the corner. So from that aspect, I think it's been great. The Christianity does need a defense, and now it's becoming more popular to defend the faith. That's all good. Obviously, that isn't the only thing that we do. We would need to then also branch out from there and, for example, do something concrete with our churches. The very simplest thing you can do is be a participating member of your church. Offer to ring the bell. Offer to do a lunch run if there's an event. If you have any kind of expertise or know somebody who does, bring them in as a guest speaker into your church. I've done some of this already myself. In the last couple of years, I've actually been invited to speak. Every time it happens, I'm always like, me? You want me to speak? And literally, I go there, I try and answer questions as well as I can, and people do enjoy it. So I've actually been given the opportunity to do it at a few universities later in the year. So that'll be very interesting. So that's one other thing that I try and do as well. Just participate in the life of your church as best as you can. As far as street evangelism, that isn't my calling. I'm not great at, having a microphone and telling people about how much like Christ loves them and attracting them that way. These things are true, but I am not well suited for that kind of evangelism. My suit is to do with apologetics. So as far as anybody else, work in terms of what you're able or what you're gifted at. People are gifted in so many things. People have like extremely good voices. They're great orators. They can speak very well. People are great with art and media. Whatever your God-given talent is, that thing that you've either worked very hard on to perfect or that thing that came naturally to you and you've been able to like multiply it and make it more beneficial for yourself and your family, use that as your vehicle to help the kingdom, because the kingdom needs help from all angles: political, financial, militarily even. So, and obviously culturally. So whatever it is that you're good at, there is a way of you integrating that into the Christian message or the Christian faith. And fundamentally, a great vehicle will always be your church.
Is there anything that you find like really interesting, or maybe interesting might be the right word, about God and his character? Or is there a particular doctrine that you're looking into at the moment? Something which interests you, basically, that animates you about God?
Oh man, there's always gonna be something, right? One interesting thing is for me is how God collaborates with human beings. I find it very, very interesting. People often ask questions around why would God allow a certain thing to happen or a certain seemingly horrific thing to occur, a flood, a battle where multiple people die, and things of that nature. And it's so interesting how it almost feels like God has not a totally, but a hands-off approach is how I'd put it, in terms of what he does with human beings. Obviously, we are given the free will and the free inclination to follow God or not. But because God knows all things, regardless of the choices that we make, God is still able to remotely interact with us in a way where he isn't overriding our wills or making us do certain things, but he can inspire us to tend towards a direction that will ultimately lead humanity as a whole to the greatest possible outcome possible. And that's what we see in Timothy, that we hear that that the will of God is that all should come and know the truth, which is synonymous with him. And so it's amazing to see how sort of God makes that happen all throughout history and even till today. So that's sort of like the one thing that really intrigues me. And like one small subsection of that is how does God, for example, in the ancient world, how does he communicate who he is to other people and also simultaneously dispel some of the notions that other people who are attempting to reach God but are doing it incorrectly, how does he dispel what they believe in while talking about the correct things? Just one small tidbit. In the creation account in Genesis, for example, and we believe that this is like revealed to Moses and then either written directly by him or scribes of his following his passing. The description given of how the earth is created is very different from how other cultures in the Near East would have thought it was created. It would be, gods having battles, and from the victory of one god, the blood of one god spills into the sea and creates the sea, and whatever the case might be. But Moses, in the revelation that he receives, is constantly counteracting these things and ultimately describing their origin as an intentional creation of God versus like an accidental creation or an accidental outcome of multiple gods during battles, as you would have in other neighboring cultures. So that continues all throughout our history and even till today. There's always going to be a way that God is going to almost remotely interact with humanity and showcase who he is in like sort of opposition to other false gods in our system. And I always find that to be very intriguing.
Love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a position, or how would you describe yourself in terms of like God's relationship, so his sovereignty plus creaturely freedom? So is there like particular, like Calvinism, for example, or this Molinism, Arminianism? Do you have a particular thought on that, or?
I don't think what I believe probably has a name. I guess, but I just need to understand where it falls. I think it's somewhat like soft Calvinism, if you will. I do not believe that, for example, that human beings are ultimately depraved and have no ability whatsoever to know God. Those things are possible. We do have freedom to choose to follow God or not. Our ultimate outcomes and our ultimate decisions are already known by God, as he knows all things, including the actions of creatures before they commit them. Jesus talks about it when as telling us as Christians how to conduct ourselves. So we are meant to pray to our Father who is in secret, not in the public markets. And also our Father in heaven knows what we want before we even ask it. But we ask it for our benefit, so to connect with God. So in terms of how God's sovereignty interacts with creaturely freedom, my view is simply a case where God is sovereign in that he is in control of all things. He creates the sandbox in the universe that we interact in. Human beings have a secondary kind of sovereignty where within that sandbox, within the limits that God has set, there are decisions that we can make that can tend us either nearer to God or away from God without God controlling us as automatons. We have instances in the Bible where God directly convicts somebody of a thing. Saul on the road to Damascus, Gideon when he's by the tree. But as we see an example of Jonah, despite God interacting with you and pointing you in one direction, we have the option to consistently go away from God. God, in cases, can pursue us in that regard, but ultimately we can't just keep saying no. And then whatever outcome we get is the outcome that we land in. So God being sovereign does not then mean that we are mindless robots. Just because somebody can make a accurate prediction on what occurs if you commit a certain action doesn't then mean that the duty or the ability for you to commit that action is something that is not your own choice. You know, if I can predict quite accurately or with a high degree of certainty that people who fall from high buildings and land on their feet might break their legs, that doesn't mean that I'm robbing you of your own individual sovereignty. God, to an even greater extent, knows exactly what will happen if you jump off that building, but that doesn't mean that you jumping off that building has no consequence or isn't a decision that you can make independently.
Nice. All of these things require a lot of knowledge and thinking and all this kind of thing. And how do you go? What's your like approach, if you like, in terms of, do you read? Do you watch podcast videos, that kind of thing?
Yep.
How do you learn?
Yep. All of the above. I'm not a big physical book fan. We have phones now on us, so everything can be downloaded and kept on hand even if you need it. So I'm more of a PDF reader. But yes, certainly PDFs are great. We have AI chatbots now. These are I think these are great for finding sources quickly as opposed to like gaining knowledge from them. This is in my personal experience. Absolutely, podcasts, videos, lectures, any source of information that I can get my hand on. In the modern day, we're not restricted in how we can access information. So any and available method is completely at your fingertips. If you want to read the Bible physically, go get a hard paper copy. If you want to have it on hand with bookmarks and color-coded itineraries on your phone, do that as well. If you want to listen to while you sleep, do that as well. Anything that can help you absorb information, go for it, is my personal opinion. I use it all.
Where can people find you, David? If they can find you.
Oh, boy. Well,
and then, if there's also anything you'd also like to, maybe if there's something on your mind or on your heart that you'd like to share with us in closing.
Okay.
Where can people find you if they can find you?
Absolutely. If they can find me. I am certainly not hidden, but I do not have an independent social media presence. I find it somewhat unnecessary. People have asked me to make a channel, and that is something that I still consider doing or not. I've just been told to even just make one to allow people to have a central place where they can follow you and then upload the videos that are filmed on SoCo, Revelation, Speakers Corner, Revival, wherever, onto that channel. I could do that in the future, but again, I don't do this as a profession. I do this simply for the love of the game, if you will, for the love of Christ. So I am not hard to find. Anywhere there's anything to do with apologetics happening in London, likely I'll be involved in some capacity. You can find me on the channels that I mentioned. But as far as me having my own independent channel, it might not be a thing that you might see anytime soon. But I will be back on this channel. Anyway, but besides that, if it's something I want people to know, I would say that people need to be convinced of things to actually go forward with them. Whether it be like a sales pitch, moving to a different country, moving to some kind of house, for example, you need to be convicted and convinced that the decision that you're making is a positive one. So my main takeaway would just be a case of, I think everybody should look into the Christian faith, look into the person of Christ, and see if by giving it an honest read and an honest interaction, if you're completely antithetical to the person of Christ, or if actually he's also a bad guy. And then the next step would be, are the things that he said relevant for you? Are you going to take some and leave some, or are you going to take him in his totality? And I think that's the thing that I think everybody should get involved in. Interact earnestly with the person of Christ, and then see if you are at all intrigued to take it a step further. Just like I would advise everyone should go to the gym, at least. And then take it a step further if you need to. If you identify a fault somewhere in your balance or in your strength that can be worked on, do that. So just as you work out at the gym, work out with Christ too.
Last bonus question.
Go for it.
So at the beginning, you mentioned that you love David in the Bible, which is
David.
also your name. So
Look at that.
give us a quick summary of why you love David. Maybe we could explore that another time.
Absolutely. David is one of the characters where we have like an extensive amount of information on him from the time when he is a child working in his father's stead as a shepherd boy, being sort of disregarded by his father. Even when Samuel comes to anoint a new king, the father instinctively prepares his older, more fitting sons to be to see Samuel and not David. So he's disregarded. But in being disregarded, he isn't downtrodden by it. Even after he's anointed by Samuel to be king, he doesn't become arrogant. He goes back to his job, tending the sheep and the flock and making sure that they are protected and cared for. So he's very dutiful, even from the time when he's a child. And he's also very brave. I admire bravery. For example, I remember being in school and seeing... being in year 7, I wasn't as tall as I am today, but seeing people get bullied by older kids, and I wanted to do something about it, but there was like a fear in my chest of potentially getting hit or whatever the case was. But then David completely bypasses that fear, because not only is he dutiful to his father, but he builds courage by taking care of things from a young age. Then you have his interaction with Goliath. And then his interactions with Saul, when he actually even, Saul is jealous of him and is actually attempting to even kill him at certain points. And he still offers Saul a service by calming his depression and his sort of moments of spiritual doubt and spiritual turmoil by playing the harp for him. So even though he's done these magnificent things like killing Goliath, he's still a servant to other people. He hasn't allowed his ego to overcome him yet. And then the person who he's tending to attempts to kill him, and he has to run away. God even gives him the chance to kill Saul on several occasions, and he still refuses because he's dutiful to Saul. And even when he eventually then goes forward and becomes king, and maybe his ego does take over, and he does terrible things, he is still repentant to God for those things. And so his story from beginning to end is so interesting, not only as an anthology of human nature and how we are shaped by our environment and our convictions, but also how power can corrupt. But then when power does corrupt, what do we do about it? Do we just stay in corruption forever, or do we return to God? And that is why David is called, the name means beloved, or he's called the man after God's heart. And I absolutely love that story. No one else has that kind of story. From the lowest of lows to the highest of highs, and then the difficulties that come with that. And then also him being so diminished when he's older that he actually needs to marry a young girl to sleep in the bed with him to keep him warm. It's very humbling that he did all these amazing things, but still, as an old man, he's so fragile that he can't even keep himself warm. So the story of David, I think, is I can talk about it forever, but it's so inspiring, also convicting, and then even very chilling at the end, that it's just, in my personal opinion, the quintessential story for manhood, if you will, in the Bible, with the exception of Christ.
David.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Boom.
Bye.